This could have been the flagship phone of 2020 if it wasn't for this.
Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of application will be written for the business world. Do you think that RIM should be worried, and what is the message for them?
You should go ask them. I have no idea what they...
What is the message that you're sending them?
We're not sending them a message. We're sending customers a message and developers a message that we're going to try to serve their needs. I mean, we went around and asked a lot of enterprise customers what they wanted.
So, did you catch that? Steve Jobs just sealed the fate of BlackBerry. The iPhone, along with the App Store, is about to vaporize BlackBerry's most loyal fan base. And Steve, he didn't even bat an eye. We all know the end of the story, right? It's been told 1,000 times. The iPhone killed BlackBerry and changes the course of smartphone history forever. But that's not the whole story. Far from it. It was actually the iPhone that catapulted BlackBerry to become one of the top smartphones in the world. The years following the launch of the original iPhone were BlackBerry's best years ever. So what exactly happened that caused this spectacular fall from grace? To answer that question, we actually need to go back to my kitchen. Hey guys, I'm John Rettinger with John4Lakers.com here, and I've got an unboxing for you of the Blackberry Bold 9000. So when I first started making YouTube videos, I focused primarily on phone unboxings and reviews, and BlackBerry phones were amongst the most popular at the time. So this is late 2007, early 2008, and you have to remember that the smartphone landscape was crazy different back then. The iPhone was a shiny new but insanely expensive and very limited compared to the competition. There were so many complaints from avid smartphone users at the time, and valid ones.
iPhone, can you record video? The Outlook does not look good.
It couldn't record video. It's locked to one carrier. It used a super slow edge data network. But chief among them was that it lacked something that they had all grown accustomed to: physical keyboard. But why? Why were these little tiny buttons and little baby screens so important? The answer might sound a little familiar even today, but it was all about the ecosystem.
Research in Motion dominates a small industrial park in Waterloo, Ontario. RIM is a Canadian high-tech Cinderella story. It invented and manufactures a pager called a BlackBerry. Its unique feature, a keyboard that allows you to send and receive email essentially in real time.
So Research in Motion, or RIM, the company behind the BlackBerry line, was started in the early 80s by two Canadian college students. The company dabbled in a bunch of random projects throughout the late 80s and early 90s, including a contract that had them working on early forms of cellular messaging between different devices, so things like pagers, fax machines, and even phones. But it wasn't until 1999 that we got our first iteration of the kind of quote modern BlackBerry. It looked like a pager, and they got its unique name from the black color of the keys on the keyboard, which kind of looked like droplets of a blackberry fruit. So RIM wanted BlackBerry to become a staple in the modern business world. And this would be the real beginning of what would grow to be their empire. So fast forward a year later in 2000, the company introduced the BlackBerry 957 to the world. And it looked way less like a pager and more like a smartphone. It ditched the traditional look of a pager for a sleeker form factor. It had a bigger screen and a spacious QWERTY keyboard, and showcased a design that would be used by the company over and over and over again for the next 10 plus years. It quickly became the device for businesses, made by business professionals and for business professionals. If you wanted to adapt to the new millennium, you needed a fleet of BlackBerries hooked right up on your belt. So as technology rapidly progressed over the years, as it tends to do, so did BlackBerry. The new models emerged with color screens and built-in microphones, and new models with different form factors that kind of began to take a consistent shape. And then came 2005, a year that would cement BlackBerry in the history books. So while consumers were going just crazy over a new phone from Motorola called, maybe you've heard of it, the Razr, BlackBerry is about to change the business world forever. Picture yourself in the mid-2000s. Email is cool and useful, but the world was kind of quickly moving to a more instant messaging style. So BlackBerry used this kind of cool time in history as a jumping off point for the new messaging service that they called, probably guessed it, Blackberry Messenger, or BBM. This was a huge deal in 2005, bringing a new messaging app to all modern BlackBerry devices that allowed its users to instantly communicate from one BlackBerry to another. So because it used data, it wasn't locked to any particular carrier. It offered an early form of read receipts even with delivered and read indicators. And BlackBerry touted the service's security as a huge hallmark feature. Any of this starting to sound familiar? Yeah, BBM was the iMessage of its time, and just as iMessage brought people to the Apple ecosystem, BBM had users flocking in stores, including myself, to buy and proudly rock a BlackBerry. So by the mid-2000s, RIM was starting to hit its stride. By the end of 2006, BlackBerry accounted for 30% of the American smartphone market, and that figure was growing fast. BBM was taking off as a de facto messaging service. The company had just introduced their first device targeted at consumers, the BlackBerry Pearl 8100. Everything seemed to be looking up for BlackBerry. Until this happened.
Every once in a while, a revolutionary product comes along that changes everything.
So, the iPhone kind of was the anti-BlackBerry. It kind of went right against everything that BlackBerry was standing for. BlackBerry was all about the physical keyboard. Apple was all about that on-screen keyboard. So it was definitely different approaches. And obviously it's been kind of famous. You see executives going back laughing at the iPhone announcement. You got that Steve Ballmer video.
$500 fully subsidized with a plan? I said, that is the most expensive phone in the world, and it doesn't appeal to business customers because it doesn't have a keyboard.
So certainly they were onto something. I think anybody with half a brain could see that the iPhone was going to be something big. It was jarringly different, and it was a jarringly different approach to not just phones, but how manufacturers worked with the carriers.
I can just take my fingers and we call it the pinch. I can bring them closer together or move them further apart to make it bigger or smaller. And so I can just move them further apart and stretch the image.
So while Steve Jobs was dazzling the world and demoing the iPhone in San Francisco, RIM executives were watching the televised recaps from the corporate headquarters in Canada. So we learned later there was many emotions among the execs, from shock and awe to disgust and even betrayal. So when Singular's CEO took the stage with Steve Jobs to discuss a partnership between the two companies, RIM executives were totally blindsided. The CEO went on and on about how great the iPhone was, and they were fuming. So at the time, carriers were not allowing manufacturers to build out full-featured web browsers on their devices, amongst a bunch of other restrictions. But it looked like, at least to the RIM executives, that Apple didn't have to play by the same rules. But in the end, and like most execs at the time, they didn't really feel Apple was a serious threat to their business. They thought the iPhone was expensive, it would probably have terrible battery life, and it wouldn't offer the same productivity with its lack of physical keyboard. RIM executives couldn't imagine a world where business professionals would choose a slab of fancy glass over the utility-packed BlackBerry, and they said they'd be fine. In hindsight, I get that this sounds like a naive statement, and RIM should have been more worried. But for a while, and in all fairness, they were totally right. The BlackBerry was chosen over the iPhone over and over again. But that was just the calm before the storm. Literally.
Who says lightning never strikes twice?
I'm gonna just stop this right there. So in the spring of 2008, RIM and Verizon partnered together to debut their response to the iPhone. This was long hyped and long awaited, and it was a form factor totally different than any kind of BlackBerry before it. It launched with a $100 million ad campaign behind it. It was the latest and greatest BlackBerry phone, and it tried to beat the iPhone in all the wrong ways. Let me put it bluntly, the Blackberry Storm was an abomination. It was an absolute mess, and argued by some, including myself, as the biggest disaster in smartphone history. Let that just sink in for a second. Although it wasn't that way at first. So when the Storm initially launched, both Verizon and RIM thought they had a home run on their hands. Why wouldn't they? In fact, when initially launched, the Storm sold over 1 million units in the first 2 months, based mostly on the reputation of RIM and BlackBerry name. But all of that started to change when consumers started to actually use their shiny new smartphones. So aside from it missing features that were standard on the iPhone, just the BlackBerry experience was really bad. It was totally inconsistent. Sometimes presses did one thing in one menu and another on another menu. You didn't know when to push the screen down all the way. Sometimes the screen wouldn't depress or wouldn't even register the press. Nothing about it worked. The phone was crashing. There was no multi-touch support. The browser, which was really such an important part of the iPhone, was an absolute mess. There was just nothing about this phone that was enjoyable. Even the on-screen keyboard, it was the first time they had done that, and BBM was still super important. Even typing on that was a really bad experience. There was just nothing that was enjoyable about using that phone, and I realized that very quickly within the first 10 or 15 minutes of trying it, that this was not a phone that should have ever been released as it was. So the Storm wasn't just a tiny misstep. It was a complete and total failure. Virtually all of the initial 1 million devices sold were either returned or replaced due to various hardware issues. Verizon was furious and demanded RIM pay $500 million to cover the loss the carrier took on the Storm. The two companies eventually came to terms on a $100 million settlement, a Blackberry Storm repair program, and a boatload of free phones for Verizon. BlackBerry walked away with more than just a bruised ego. For the first time ever, they had a colossal failure. So despite the Storm's missteps, BlackBerry was still on the up and up for the next few years. In 2009, a new and improved Storm 2 launched, and it fixed many of the predecessor's issues. The company also continued releasing new versions of its bread and butter devices with physical keyboards, and BlackBerry continued growing, owning about 20% of the global smartphone market. But that would quickly change. But despite kind of revisionist history, the iPhone was not the immediate dagger to the BlackBerry's heart like most people nowadays assume. It was more like the start of a death by 1,000 cuts. Every year there was a new iPhone that was obviously much faster, sleeker, and more capable than the model before it. The support for enterprise-level tech did eventually come, and the biggest threat to BlackBerry was no longer the iPhone's hardware, but its software. And more importantly, this little experiment called the App Store. Remember when Steve Jobs said,
"We're not sending them a message, we're sending customers a message and developers a message that we're going to try to serve their needs." I mean, we went around and asked a lot of enterprise customers what they wanted.
This was Apple squaring up and coming after RIM's core business. Consumers were wowed by the iPhone and its ability, but Steve Jobs kinda knew consumers would be the easy side. The real challenge would be convincing enterprises to ditch their fleet of BlackBerries for the iPhone. Adding enterprise support into the iPhone software was a good first step, but the App Store was going to be the biggest draw. And then, right after that, Phil Schiller said this.
Exactly right. This is about addressing what customers want and making the best product ever for enterprise customers because we listen to them and we move quickly to make a killer product.
Moving quickly. That was something Apple had done since the iPhone launched. They slashed prices, they offered new storage options, and they brought new features year over year in software updates. RIM, on the other hand, was not a company known for moving quickly, and their software was seriously starting to lag behind the competition. In 2010, Steve Jobs did something kinda out of the ordinary. He dialed into a shareholders conference call, gloated on beating RIM, but also offered them some free advice.
We've now passed RIM, and I don't see them catching up with us in the foreseeable future. They must move beyond their area of strength and comfort into the unfamiliar territory of trying to become a software platform company. I think it's going to be a challenge for them to create a competitive platform and to convince developers to create apps for yet a third software platform after iOS and Android.
So having the benefit of hindsight here, Steve was clearly right. It wasn't just the iPhone that RIM had to compete with. The smartphone landscape was changing fast. Google's Android had now entered the game, offering a whole new level of customization and a feature set that a ton of consumers had really been waiting for. Compared to iOS and Android, BlackBerry OS looked old, stale, and very out of touch with the new tech reality. And then came the day that would ultimately seal BlackBerry's fate.
Now, and this is the day a lot of people have been waiting for. The iPhone is finally coming to another network.
Verizon customers expected to, at some point, be lined up today to get their new toy. News 8's Kent Pierce.
Probably one of the worst kept secrets in tech, but in 2011, the iPhone came to Verizon, and BlackBerry was rapidly losing its dominance. All the initial criticism, the iPhone's poor battery life, lack of enterprise software support, and carrier incompatibility was over. The iPhone was getting into the hands of more and more consumers thanks to the new CDMA carrier support, and BlackBerry just couldn't keep up. And it wasn't just consumers. Business customers, BlackBerry's most loyal customer base, were also leaving in droves. Users had become accustomed to the virtual keyboard. It had a full browser, a better email experience, and this new service called iMessage looked like it could be a real threat to BBM, which was quickly becoming no longer the big draw it once was to the BlackBerry ecosystem. So and then, just a year later, in 2012, the BlackBerry market share the company was so proud of dropped significantly. So remember, they had a 20% market share in 2009, and just 3 years later, captured under 5% of the global smartphone market. The next few years would be dark times for BlackBerry. There'd be some big layoffs, a failed experimental tablet, a corporate restructuring, and a Hail Mary plan to get the BlackBerry name back on track.
So my beloved has fallen on hard times, but now it's trying to fight its way back. At an event today, the Research in Motion team launched what they hope is a massive comeback. And there were some big announcements.
So meet the Blackberry Z10. It was a new high-end phone that ran the all-new BlackBerry OS 10. The hardware was generally well received, but the software was still majorly lacking. But the bigger issue with the Z10 was a lack of any real third-party app support. The company had promised 70,000 third-party apps would be available on BlackBerry OS 10, but most of them were simply junk. So instead of just opting to develop the phone around Android, RIM, which had just changed its official company name to BlackBerry in an effort to show its commitment to the brand, opted to rebuild from the ground up around the QNX operating system. So suffice to say, developers weren't flocking to develop for it, especially when iOS and Android had a much more active and well-established user bases. Initially, analysts were optimistic at first, predicting BlackBerry would still sell nearly 2 million Z10s globally. But after the phone was released and reviews hit the web, that figure dropped to just below 300,000. And I'm sure you know where the story goes from here. BlackBerry made a few more attempts to revive the brand for their most loyal customers. They introduced the BlackBerry Passport, this little square phone, and the Classic, both sported the infamous physical QWERTY keyboard. But without the app support consumers had come to expect, the phones just didn't take off. Eventually, the company abandoned BBOS 10 together, launching the BlackBerry Priv in 2015 that finally ran Android. But by then, despite the Priv being a pretty solid phone, it was too little, too late. Things changed in 2016. BlackBerry announced they would no longer be making their own phones, instead licensing the rights to TCL to design and manufacture new phones with the BlackBerry name attached to it. The company was instead going to focus its efforts on its software and services for enterprise customers and just let TCL handle the phone side of the business. TCL did their best to bring BlackBerry back to its glory days, and to their credit, the Key 1 and Key 2 were pretty good phones. But despite their best efforts, the phones just didn't sell that well. And in 2017, BlackBerry officially owned 0% of the smartphone market. It's sad to talk and think about BlackBerry this way, a company that was so important in my consumer electronics life and was so prevalent all over the world, to have just missed the mark so completely and so physically. And we're looking back at this obviously with the benefit of hindsight. They should have done this, they should have done that. Of course, the executives at the time thought they were doing the right thing, But having the benefit of the lens of time, you can really see the huge mistakes that were made. And you wonder if BlackBerry had adapted quicker, what would the brand be today? If they hadn't tried to release, the new Blackberry 10 that could sort of run Android apps, they had just embraced Android and put their own flavor on top of Android really early. Would BlackBerry be a huge player now? Could they be competing with the Samsungs of the world and OnePlus? I think in a lot of ways they could. The story of BlackBerry is the story of a company stuck in its ways, unwilling to innovate and change with the world around them. RIM executives didn't take the iPhone seriously. They laughed it off and didn't choose to compete and innovate. That decision ultimately cost them everything. And as the smartphone world rapidly changed, the BlackBerry didn't change with it. And when RIM finally decided to compete with the iPhone on its own timetable, it was far too late. They lost, and I don't see a way they could ever come back.